The monastery bells had fallen silent 3 moons ago, yet Brother Kenji continued his morning walks through the temple grounds as if their bronze voices still called the faithful to prayer. His bare feet followed the worn stone path that generations of monks had polished smooth, with their devotion each step a meditation in itself. The abbot had summoned him that morning with news that would change everything. The village below had grown restless without the bell's guidance. Merchants arrived late to market, children forgot their lessons, and the elderly wandered in confusion without the familiar chimes that had structured their days for centuries. The townspeople had begun to whisper that the mountain spirits were angry that some great misfortune would befall them all. Kenji accepted the mission without question. He would descend into the valley and seek the legendary silent bell spoken of only in the most ancient texts hidden deep within the monastery's archives. According to the worn scrolls, this bell possessed the power to restore harmony without making a sound, to call souls to peace through its very presence rather than its voice. The journey began before dawn. Kenji carried nothing but his walking staff, a small pouch of rice, and the weight of an entire community's hope. The mountain path wound downward through forests where morning mist clung to ancient pines like the breath of sleeping giants. Each footfall seemed to echo with purpose, though no sound reached his ears. In the first village he encountered, Kenji found chaos masquerading as normal life. Farmers argued over boundaries they had respected for generations. Shopkeepers cheated customers they had served faithfully for decades. Children cried without comfort, their parents too distracted to offer solace. The absence of the monastery bells had created a void that discord rushed to fill. An elderly woman approached him as he sat beside the village well. Her eyes held the clouded confusion of someone who had lost their anchor in time. She spoke of dreams filled with silence so complete, it felt like drowning, of waking each morning uncertain whether the sun had truly risen or if she remained trapped in endless night. Kenji listened without offering easy answers. The silent bell, if it existed, would not be found through seeking alone. The ancient texts spoke in riddles, mentioning a sound that was not a sound, a calling that could only be heard by those who had learned to listen with more than their ears. That night, sleeping beneath stars that seemed unusually bright, Kenji dreamed of his childhood in the monastery. He remembered the first time he had truly heard the bells, not just their bronze voices echoing across the valley, but their deeper message. It was not the sound that mattered, but the silence between the notes, the space where meaning lived. He woke with understanding beginning to dawn like the first light touching mountain peaks. The silent bell was not an object to be found, but a state to be achieved. Every person carried within them the capacity for this silence, this peace that needed no external confirmation. The second village revealed deeper troubles. Here, the absence of the bells had created such anxiety that people had begun creating their own chaotic rhythms. Pots clanged at all hours, children banged sticks against fences, and merchants rang cowbells to announce their wares. The noise was deafening, a desperate attempt to fill the void left by the monastery's silence. Kenji sat in the village square and simply breathed. He made no sound, offered no teachings, performed no rituals. He simply existed in complete stillness while chaos swirled around him. Gradually, individuals began to notice his presence. A harried mother paused in her scolding. A merchant stopped his incessant bell ringing. A group of arguing farmers fell silent. The silence began to spread like ripples on a still pond. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something deeper. People found themselves pausing in their daily rush, taking deeper breaths, looking at each other with recognition rather than suspicion. The frantic energy that had gripped the village began to settle like dust after a storm. An old merchant approached Kenji as the sun reached its zenith. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he spoke of the fear that had consumed him since the bells stopped. Without their guidance, he had lost faith in his own judgment, begun to doubt every decision, every transaction, every relationship he had built over decades of honest trade. Kenji remained silent, but his presence conveyed understanding. The merchant gradually calmed his breathing, deepened, and something shifted in his expression. He began to speak of memories from before the bells, of the inner compass that had guided him through difficult decisions, of the wisdom that existed independently of external validation. As afternoon shadows lengthened, more villagers gathered around Kenji, not to hear him speak, but to share in the quality of silence he embodied. It was not empty silence, but silence full of potential, pregnant with peace. Children stopped their restless movement and settled into quiet play. Adults found themselves listening more carefully to each other, speaking more thoughtfully when they did choose to break the silence. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Without any words or actions from Kenji, the village was finding its own rhythm, its own sense of timing and harmony. The silent bell was revealing itself not as an external object, but as an internal capacity that had always existed, waiting to be remembered. By evening, the entire character of the village had shifted. People moved with greater intention, spoke with more consideration, and listened with deeper attention. The frantic energy of the morning had given way to a calm purposefulness that seemed to emanate from within each person rather than being imposed from without. Kenji prepared to continue his journey, knowing that his work in this village was complete. The silent bell had been found not through seeking, but through being, not through action, but through presence. The villagers had rediscovered their own inner source of harmony, their own capacity for the silence that gives meaning to all sound. As he walked toward the mountains, Kenji carried with him the growing certainty that every village, every person, every moment contained the potential for this discovery. The silent bell was everywhere and nowhere, always present for those who learned to listen with their hearts rather than their ears. The mountain path rose steep and treacherous as Kenji began his ascent home, yet each step felt lighter than the last. The weight of his mission had transformed from burden to understanding, and with it came a profound shift in how he perceived his surroundings. The ancient pines no longer seemed like silent sentinels guarding secrets, but rather wise companions sharing in the eternal dance of presence and absence. 3 days into his climb, Kenji encountered a group of pilgrims who had lost their way. They wandered in circles, their voices raised in panic and frustration, their footsteps creating a chaotic rhythm against the mountain silence. Their leader, a merchant from the capital, clutched an ornate bell that he rang incessantly, believing its sound would guide them to safety. Kenji watched from a distance as the group's anxiety fed upon itself. The more lost they became, the more desperately they rang their bell, and the more its harsh clanging seemed to drive away any possibility of finding their true direction. The merchant's face showed the strain of someone who had placed all faith in external guidance, only to find it inadequate when faced with genuine uncertainty. Without announcing his presence, Kenji simply sat upon a nearby boulder and entered the deep stillness he had discovered in the village below. He made no effort to attract attention or offer assistance, but simply embodied the quality of silence that had proven so transformative. The silence was not empty or passive, but alive with awareness, pregnant with possibility. Gradually, the frantic bell ringing began to slow. The merchant found himself pausing between strikes, listening to something he could not quite identify. The other pilgrims noticed this change and began to quiet their own agitated voices. In the growing silence, they became aware of subtle sounds they had been drowning out with their panic. The distant murmur of a stream, the call of birds that indicated the direction of the valley, the whisper of wind that carried the scent of the village they sought. The merchant approached Kenji with hesitation, his ornate bell hanging silent in his hands. His eyes held the confusion of someone discovering that their most trusted tool had become their greatest obstacle. Without speaking, he sat beside the monk and allowed the mountain silence to fill the spaces within himself that had been occupied by fear and desperate action. As the sun reached its zenith, the entire group had gathered around Kenji in wordless communion. The silence they shared was not the absence of sound, but the presence of deep listening. Each person began to access their own inner compass, their own capacity for discernment that had been obscured by the noise of their panic. When they finally departed, the pilgrims moved with quiet confidence, their steps synchronized not with external rhythm, but with the deeper pulse of their own authentic knowing. The merchant left his ornate bell at the base of the boulder where Kenji sat, understanding that true guidance came not from manufactured sound, but from the silence that allows inner wisdom to emerge. Kenji continued his ascent, carrying with him the profound realization that the silent bell was not merely a tool for bringing peace to others, but a state of being that transformed the very nature of existence. Every encounter became an opportunity to embody this silence, to create space for others to discover their own inner source of harmony. The fourth village he entered presented the greatest challenge yet. Here, the absence of the monastery bells had created not chaos, but a different kind of suffering, a creeping despair that had settled over the community like morning fog that never lifted. People moved through their daily routines with mechanical precision, but their eyes held the emptiness of those who had lost faith in the possibility of joy. The village elder, a woman whose back had been bent by decades of service to her community, approached Kenji with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. She spoke of dreams that had withered in the silence of young people who had abandoned their hopes for the future of a collective spirit that seemed to have dimmed like a flame starved of oxygen. Kenji spent 7 days in this village, not teaching or preaching, but simply living among the people with the quality of presence he had discovered. He worked alongside the farmers in their fields, his silence creating space for them to reconnect with the satisfaction of honest labor. He sat with the elderly as they shared their stories, his deep listening helping them remember the wisdom they carried within their weathered hearts. The transformation in this village was slower and more subtle than in the others. It began with small shifts, a farmer humming while he worked, a child laughing with genuine delight, a young woman speaking of dreams she had thought forgotten. The silence Kenji embodied was not imposing itself upon the community, but creating conditions for their own natural vitality to emerge. By the end of his stay, the village had rediscovered something precious that had been buried beneath their despair. not manufactured happiness or forced optimism, but a quiet confidence in the value of their simple lives, a trust in the cycles of season and harvest, birth and death that had sustained their ancestors for countless generations. The young woman who had spoken of forgotten dreams approached Kenji on his final morning in the village. She carried with her a small bell, not ornate like the merchants, but simple and pure in its craftsmanship. When she struck it, it produced a sound so clear and true that it seemed to capture the essence of the mountain silence itself. She offered the bell to Kenji, explaining that it had belonged to her grandmother, who had always claimed it possessed special properties. The old woman had said that this bell could only be heard by those who truly needed its guidance, and that its sound would always lead them home, whether to a place or to themselves. Kenji accepted the gift with deep gratitude, understanding that he had found not the silent bell of legend, but something far more precious. The recognition that every authentic sound emerged from silence, and every meaningful silence gave birth to sound. The bell the young woman offered was not silent in the way he had expected, but its sound was so pure, so aligned with the natural harmony of existence, that it served the same function as silence itself. The final portion of his journey took him through landscapes that seemed to mirror his inner transformation. The harsh edges of the mountain path softened into gentle slopes. The severe pines gave way to meadows filled with wild flowers that swayed in breezes that seemed to carry the whispered wisdom of the earth itself. As Kenji approached the monastery, he could see the familiar buildings perched on their rocky outcropping like lotus flowers blooming from stone. The sight filled him with profound peace, not because he was returning to safety and comfort, but because he was bringing back something infinitely valuable, the understanding that the silent bell had always existed within the hearts of all beings, waiting only for the right conditions to be recognized and awakened. The abbot met him at the monastery gates, his ancient eyes bright with curiosity and expectation. Kenji bowed deeply and presented the simple bell he had received from the young woman, explaining that this was not the legendary silent bell of the ancient texts, but something equally precious, proof that the silence they sought was not separate from sound, but was the source from which all authentic sound emerged. That evening, as the community gathered for their twilight meditation, Kenji rang the bell once. Its clear, pure tone echoed across the valley, reaching the villages below, with a sound that seemed to emerge from the silence itself. The people who heard it felt not the imposition of external rhythm, but the recognition of a harmony that had always existed within their own hearts. The monastery bells remained silent, but their silence was no longer empty. It had become full of possibility, pregnant with the understanding that true guidance comes not from external sources, but from the deep listening that allows inner wisdom to emerge. The silent bell had been found not as an object or artifact, but as a quality of being that transformed both the seeker and the sought. In the days that followed, pilgrims began arriving at the monastery, drawn not by the promise of hearing mystical sounds, but by the reputation of a place where silence had been discovered to be not the absence of sound, but the presence of profound peace. Each visitor found within the monastery walls not answers to their questions, but the silence that allowed their own inner wisdom to speak. Kenji continued his simple life within the monastery community, but now every moment was infused with the understanding he had gained. Whether sweeping the courtyards, tending the garden, or sitting in meditation, he embodied the quality of the silent bell, creating space for others to discover their own capacity for deep peace. The legend of the silent bell spread throughout the region, but it was no longer a story about a mystical object hidden in some distant place. It had become a living teaching about the silence that exists within every heart, waiting to be recognized and shared. The true bell had been found at last, not in some ancient temple or sacred grove, but in the simple act of listening deeply to the wisdom that emerges when the mind becomes still. The seasons turned with gentle persistence, and the understanding that Kenji had brought back to the monastery began to permeate every aspect of life within its ancient walls. The abbot, whose wisdom had been gathered through decades of contemplation, recognized that something fundamental had shifted in the spiritual ecosystem of their mountain sanctuary. The silence that now filled the meditation halls was not the hollow quiet of absence, but the rich stillness of presence. Brother Kenji found himself transformed not into a teacher in the conventional sense, but into a living embodiment of the silent bell's essence. His daily routines continued unchanged. The same sweeping of courtyards, the same tending of vegetables in the monastery garden, the same participation in communal meals. Yet, these simple activities now carried a quality that seemed to awaken something dormant in those around him. The other monks began to notice subtle changes in their own practice. Brother Han, who had struggled for years with restless thoughts during meditation, discovered that sitting near Kenji created a field of stillness that allowed his mind to settle naturally. Brother Wei, whose attempts at compassionate service had often felt forced and effortful, found that working alongside Kenji in the garden taught him how kindness could emerge spontaneously from inner quietude. The simple bell that the young woman had given Kenji was placed in the main meditation hall not as an object of worship or mystical power, but as a reminder of the truth he had discovered. Its presence seemed to anchor the understanding that had been gained, creating space for others to recognize the same silence within themselves. Word of the monastery's transformation began to spread through the network of pilgrims, merchants, and travelers who passed through the region. Unlike the dramatic tales that usually accompanied spiritual legends, this story traveled quietly, passed from person to person through subtle recognition rather than dramatic proclamation. Those who visited the monastery found not spectacular teachings or miraculous events, but something far more valuable, the direct experience of their own capacity for deep peace. A scholar from the capital arrived seeking ancient texts about the legendary silent bell, convinced that such wisdom must be preserved in written form. He spent weeks searching through the monastery's archives, studying every scroll and manuscript that might contain references to the mystical artifact. Yet gradually, through his immersion in the monastery's transformed atmosphere, he began to understand that the knowledge he sought could not be found in texts, but only in the living silence that pervaded every corner of the sacred space. The scholar's transformation was particularly significant because it demonstrated how intellectual seeking could give way to direct knowing. His sharp analytical mind, trained to dissect and categorize spiritual concepts, gradually relaxed into a more receptive state. He began to participate in the daily life of the monastery, not as a researcher gathering information, but as a seeker, allowing himself to be changed by what he encountered. When the scholar finally departed, he carried with him not scrolls or written teachings, but the seed of silence that had been planted in his heart. He returned to the capital transformed, and his quiet presence began to affect the intellectual circles in which he moved. Debates that had once been heated exchanges of opposing viewpoints became thoughtful explorations of deeper truth. Students who had been anxious about examinations found themselves studying with greater ease and retention when they attended his lectures. The ripple effects of the silent bell's influence continued to expand in ever-widening circles. Merchants who had stopped at the monastery during their travels carried the quality of presence they had experienced into marketplaces throughout the region. Their business dealings became more honest and fair, not from moral effort, but from a natural alignment with truth that seemed to emerge from their contact with genuine silence. Farmers who had brought offerings to the monastery returned to their fields with a deeper connection to the rhythms of earth and season. Their crops flourished not because of any supernatural blessing, but because their work had become an expression of harmony rather than struggle. They found themselves planting and harvesting with an intuitive timing that seemed to align with forces greater than their individual will. The monastery itself continued to evolve as more seekers arrived, drawn by reports of the profound peace that could be found there. Yet, this was not the peace of withdrawal from the world, but the peace that made engagement with life more authentic and effective. The monks found that their capacity for service expanded naturally as their inner stillness deepened. Brother Kenji established a practice of spending time each day sitting quietly in the village squares of the communities that dotted the mountain valleys. He made no announcements about his presence and offered no formal teachings, but simply made himself available as a reminder of the silence that existed within every person. His presence became a kind of tuning fork, helping others remember their own capacity for inner harmony. The children in these villages were often the first to respond to Kenji's presence. Their natural openness allowed them to recognize the quality of silence he embodied without the mental resistance that sometimes blocked adults. They would gather around him not seeking entertainment or instruction, but drawn by an instinctive recognition of something familiar and comforting. These children, touched by authentic silence in their formative years, grew up with a different relationship to stress and conflict than previous generations. They possessed an innate ability to return to center when overwhelmed, to listen deeply before speaking, to act from wisdom rather than mere reaction. Their influence on their families and communities was subtle but profound, creating a generational shift toward greater harmony and understanding. The young woman who had given Kenji the bell became one of the most powerful carriers of the silent bell's influence, though she never sought any kind of recognition or status. She continued her simple life in her village, but her presence had been so thoroughly transformed by her brief encounter with authentic silence that she became a source of healing for everyone around her. People began seeking her out, not for advice or instruction, but simply to be in her presence. Troubled marriages found new harmony after couples spent time in her home. Sick individuals discovered that their healing accelerated when she cared for them. Conflicts that had divided the community for years resolved naturally when the disputants found themselves in her peaceful company. The transformation was not limited to human communities. The very landscape around the monastery seemed to respond to the quality of consciousness that now pervaded the region. Wildlife appeared more frequently and with less fear, as if sensing that they were in the presence of beings who meant them no harm. The gardens produced more abundant harvests with less effort. Even the weather patterns seemed to become more gentle and supportive of life. Scientists and scholars who visited the region to study these phenomena found themselves unable to explain what they observed through conventional means. The improvements in crop yields, the unusual harmony among wildlife, the measurable decreases in stress-related illnesses among the human population, all defied simple cause and effect explanations. Yet those who spent sufficient time in the region began to understand that they were witnessing the effects of consciousness aligned with the deepest principles of existence. The abbot, now advanced in years, began to prepare for the transition of leadership within the monastery. He recognized that the understanding Kenji had brought back represented not just a personal realization, but a new chapter in the monastery's long history of spiritual service. The silent bell had revealed itself not as an ancient artifact to be preserved, but as a living truth that needed to be embodied and shared in each generation. The selection of the next abbot became an opportunity to demonstrate the principles that had been discovered. Rather than choosing based on scholarly achievement or administrative skill, the community looked for the monk who most clearly embodied the quality of silence that had transformed their practice. The choice was unanimous and immediate. Brother Kenji was recognized not as someone who possessed special knowledge, but as someone who had become a clear channel for the wisdom that belonged to all. Kenji's acceptance of this responsibility marked the beginning of a new era for the monastery. Under his guidance, the community became even more integrated with the surrounding region, serving not as a separate spiritual enclave, but as the heart of a larger network of awakened consciousness. The monastery's influence continued to spread, but always through the gentle power of example, rather than through proselytizing or dramatic demonstration. The silent bell had fulfilled its legendary promise, but not in the way the ancient texts had suggested. Rather than being found as an external object that could bring peace to the world, it had revealed itself as the innate capacity for silence that existed within every conscious being. The bell that rang without sound was the human heart at rest in its own true nature, creating harmony not through effort, but through the simple act of being authentically present. Years passed, and the story of the silent bell continued to evolve. New generations of monks carried the understanding forward, each adding their own realization to the collective wisdom of the community. Pilgrims continued to arrive seeking the legendary bell, and each discovered it in their own unique way, according to their readiness and capacity. The simple bell that had been placed in the meditation hall eventually cracked with age, but this physical deterioration only served to reinforce the teaching it represented. The true silent bell was not dependent on any external form, but existed as the timeless silence from which all authentic sound emerged, and to which it inevitably returned. Brother Kenji now, Abbot Kenji, continued his practice of sitting in village squares, but his presence had become so refined that even his physical absence seemed to carry the quality of silence he embodied. People would gather in places where he had sat, finding that the space itself had been somehow consecrated by his presence, transformed into a sanctuary where inner peace could be more easily accessed. The legend of the silent bell had become reality, not through the discovery of a mystical artifact, but through the recognition of the sacred silence that existed within every moment, every being, every breath. The bell that had been sought in distant places had been found in the most intimate location of all the quiet center of conscious awareness that was the true home of every seeker. The decades flowed like water over smooth stones each year, adding its wisdom to the growing understanding that had transformed the mountain monastery and the communities it served. Abbot Kenji, now bearing the weight of advanced years with the same grace he had once carried his simple walking staff, witnessed the profound evolution of consciousness that continued to ripple outward from their sacred center. The monastery had become something unprecedented in its long history, not merely a place of retreat from the world, but a living demonstration of how spiritual realization could transform ordinary existence. The boundaries between sacred and secular had dissolved so completely that pilgrims often remarked they could no longer distinguish between the monastery grounds and the surrounding villages, as if the entire region had become a single integrated sanctuary. Young monks arrived from distant lands, drawn by stories that had traveled far beyond the mountain valleys. These seekers came expecting to find ancient techniques or secret practices, but instead discovered something far more revolutionary. The understanding that enlightenment was not a distant goal to be achieved through effort, but a present reality to be recognized through stillness. Brother Tashi, who had arrived as a restless youth consumed by spiritual ambition, spent his first months at the monastery in profound confusion. He had memorized countless texts, mastered complex meditation techniques, and practiced austerities that had earned him recognition in his homeland. Yet within the monastery's atmosphere of natural peace, all his accumulated knowledge seemed suddenly irrelevant. The turning point came during a simple afternoon of working in the vegetable garden alongside Abbot Kenji. No profound teachings were shared, no mystical experiences occurred, yet something in the quality of shared silence while planting seeds caused all of Tashi's spiritual striving to simply fall away. In that moment, he understood that the enlightenment he had sought so desperately had been present all along, obscured only by the very effort to attain it. Tashi's transformation became a teaching in itself for other arriving seekers. His journey from complex seeking to simple being demonstrated how the silent bell's influence worked not through addition, but through subtraction, not through gaining something new, but through releasing what was unnecessary. The network of influence that had grown from the monastery's transformation now spanned multiple kingdoms and cultural regions. Merchants, scholars, artisans, and farmers who had been touched by authentic silence carried that quality into every aspect of their lives, creating nodes of peace that naturally attracted others seeking genuine fulfillment. In the capital cities, where political intrigue and economic competition had long dominated social relations, something remarkable began to emerge. Government officials who had encountered the monastery's influence found themselves approaching their duties with greater wisdom and less personal ambition. Trade negotiations that had traditionally been adversarial became collaborative explorations of mutual benefit. Even military leaders discovered that conflicts could be resolved through understanding rather than force. The phenomenon was so subtle yet so transformative that scholars began studying what they termed the mountain influence. Universities sent researchers to investigate the sociological and psychological changes occurring in regions connected to the monastery, but their findings consistently pointed to factors that could not be easily quantified or replicated through conventional means. One such researcher, a brilliant philosopher named Master Chen, spent 3 years documenting the changes he observed in communities influenced by the monastery's teaching. His initial intention was to create a comprehensive theory that could explain and perhaps replicate the transformation he witnessed. However, his prolonged exposure to the very phenomenon he studied gradually changed his relationship to knowledge itself. Master Chen's final report submitted to the Imperial Academy contained a startling conclusion. The changes he had observed could not be understood through analytical study alone, but only through direct participation in the consciousness that created them. His recommendation was not for further research, but for direct experience of the silence that seemed to be the source of all positive transformation. The Academy's initial reaction was skeptical, but when several of its most respected members visited the monastery region to investigate Chen's claims, they returned with similar reports. The traditional boundaries between observer and observed, knower and known, seemed to dissolve in the presence of authentic silence, revealing a more fundamental unity that transformed both the subject and object of study. These developments marked the beginning of what historians would later call the Great Quieting, a gradual shift in human consciousness that began in the mountain regions and slowly spread throughout the known world. Unlike previous spiritual movements that had been characterized by dramatic revelations or charismatic leaders, this transformation occurred through the simple recognition of the peace that had always existed within ordinary awareness. Abbot Kenji, now in his final years, spent increasing time in deep contemplation of the mystery he had helped to unveil. The silent bell that he had once sought as an external object had revealed itself as the very nature of consciousness itself, the fundamental silence from which all experience emerged and to which it returned. This understanding had become so integrated into his being that his mere presence continued to awaken recognition in others long after his ability to teach through words had diminished. The monastery's daily rhythms had evolved to support ever deeper levels of collective realization. The traditional periods of formal meditation had given way to a continuous state of meditative awareness that permeated all activities. Meals were taken in contemplative silence that was rich with communion. Work was performed as moving meditation that celebrated the sacred nature of simple tasks. Visitors often commented that time seemed to move differently within the monastery. Grounds not slower or faster, but with a quality of presence that made each moment feel complete in itself. The anxiety about past and future that dominated ordinary consciousness seemed to dissolve in the face of such profound engagement with the eternal now. The young woman who had originally given Kenji the simple bell had become an elder in her own village, her life, a testament to how ordinary existence could be transformed by authentic spiritual realization. Though she had never formally studied with teachers or undertaken elaborate spiritual practices, her natural embodiment of inner silence had made her a source of wisdom for generations of seekers. Her home had become an unofficial pilgrimage destination, though she never promoted herself as a teacher or charged fees for her guidance. People simply found that spending time in her presence helped them remember something essential they had forgotten about their own nature. Her influence was so gentle and natural that many were transformed without realizing that any teaching had occurred. The bell she had given to Kenji so many years ago had long since crumbled to dust, but its legacy lived on in the countless lives that had been touched by the understanding it represented. Each person who recognized the silent bell within their own heart became capable of awakening that same recognition in others, creating an ever-expanding network of conscious individuals who served as living reminders of humanity's deepest potential. The monastery's influence on the natural world had become even more pronounced over the years. The forests surrounding the sacred grounds had grown unusually lush and vibrant, supporting wildlife populations that thrived in the peaceful atmosphere created by decades of contemplative practice. Scientists who studied these phenomena found that the measurable improvements in ecosystem health correlated directly with the depth of spiritual realization achieved by the human communities in each area. This correlation between consciousness and environmental well-being suggested profound implications for humanity's relationship with the natural world. The silent bell's influence seemed to restore not only individual peace, but the fundamental harmony between human awareness and the larger systems of life that supported all existence. As Abbot Kenji approached his final years, he began to prepare the monastery for the transition that would occur after his death. Yet, this preparation involved not the selection of a successor or the preservation of particular teachings, but the deepening of the understanding that had made his individual role unnecessary. The silent bell had become so integrated into the consciousness of the entire community that its expression no longer depended on any single person. The true measure of the monastery's transformation was that it had become transparent to the truth it embodied. Like a clear window that reveals the landscape beyond it, the entire institution had become a means for others to recognize their own innate wisdom rather than a repository of special knowledge or power. Pilgrims who visited during this period often reported that they could no longer identify what made the monastery different from other spiritual centers they had known. The practices were simple, the lifestyle unadorned, the teachings minimal. Yet, something in the quality of being that permeated every aspect of life. There created conditions for profound transformation that no amount of elaborate technique or complex philosophy had been able to produce. The silent bell had achieved its ultimate purpose. It had awakened itself in the hearts of countless beings, creating a resonance that would continue to spread long after its original discoverers had passed from the world. The legend had become a reality, not through the finding of a mystical object, but through the recognition that the object of all seeking was the very awareness that was doing the seeking. In his final teaching, given not through words but through the quality of his peaceful passing, Abbot Kenji demonstrated that even death was simply another note in the eternal silence that connected all existence. His body returned to the earth of the mountain he had served so faithfully, but the silent bell he had embodied continued to ring in every heart that had been opened by his presence. The monastery remained, but it had become something more than a place. It had become a living symbol of the possibility that existed within every human community to discover its own capacity for profound peace. The silent bell's echo would continue to sound across the generations, calling all beings home to the silence that was their deepest nature and their greatest gift to the world. The years following Abbot Kenji's passing unfolded with the same gentle inevitability that had characterized his life each season, bringing deeper integration of the understanding he had embodied. The monastery continued to serve as a beacon of transformation, yet its influence had become so woven into the fabric of ordinary existence that pilgrims often arrived without realizing they were already walking on sacred ground. Brother Tashi, now approaching middle age, had assumed the role of abbot not through appointment or succession, but through the natural recognition of his complete embodiment of the silent bell's essence. His leadership was so transparent that many visitors failed to identify him as the monastery's guiding presence. mistaking his profound ordinariness for simple humility, rather than recognizing it as the mark of complete spiritual maturity. The transformation that had begun with one monk's search for a legendary bell had evolved into something far beyond what the ancient texts had envisaged. Entire regions now operated according to principles that emerged from the recognition of inner silence, creating societies that functioned with unprecedented harmony and effectiveness. Wars that had raged for generations simply ended as conflicting parties discovered common ground in the silence that connected all consciousness. The phenomenon had attracted attention from the furthest reaches of the known world. Emissaries arrived from distant kingdoms seeking to understand how such profound social transformation could occur without coercion or elaborate systems of governance. They invariably departed with the same bewildered recognition that their predecessors had experienced. The changes they witnessed could not be replicated through external methods, but only through the awakening of consciousness itself. A particularly significant development occurred when the emperor of the eastern provinces, renowned for his military conquests and administrative brilliance, undertook a personal pilgrimage to the monastery region. His initial motivation was strategic, seeking to understand how the mountain communities had achieved such stability and prosperity without centralized control or standing armies. The emperor spent 3 months traveling incognito through villages that had been influenced by the monastery's teaching. His trained eye for political analysis gradually gave way to something unprecedented. In his experience, genuine wonder at the possibility of human community based on wisdom rather than power. The competitive drive that had fueled his rise to imperial authority began to quiet in the face of societies that had transcended the need for dominance hierarchies. When the emperor finally revealed his identity and requested audience with Abbot Tashi, he found himself in the strange position of seeking guidance from someone who possessed no worldly authority, yet embodied a form of leadership that made conventional power structures seem crude and ineffective. The meeting that followed was less a formal diplomatic encounter than a recognition of the profound transformation that authentic silence could bring to any human endeavor. The emperor's return to his capital marked the beginning of changes that would eventually reshape the entire political landscape of the Eastern world. His governance became increasingly characterized by listening rather than commanding, by creating conditions for wisdom to emerge rather than imposing solutions through force. His ministers, initially confused by this shift in imperial style, gradually discovered that policies formulated through collective contemplation proved more effective and sustainable than those dictated through traditional hierarchical methods. These political transformations were accompanied by equally profound changes in economic and social structures. Merchants who had embraced the understanding emanating from the monastery region found that business relationships based on mutual benefit rather than competitive advantage created unprecedented prosperity for all parties involved. The concept of profit evolved from short-term extraction to long-term stewardship, naturally aligning economic activity with environmental and social well-being. The monastery itself had become something entirely new in human history, an institution that had transcended its own institutional nature. The buildings remained, the daily rhythms continued. New monks arrived and elder ones departed, yet the essential function had shifted from preserving tradition to embodying a living truth that was always fresh and immediate. Brother Wei, who had spent decades studying the monastery's archives, made a remarkable discovery during this period. Hidden within the most ancient texts were prophecies that had never been properly understood until now. The legendary silent bell had indeed been described in these writings, but not as an object to be found or a goal to be achieved. The texts spoke of a time when the bell would ring itself into existence through the awakening of human consciousness itself. This revelation cast new light on the entire journey that had begun with Kenji's original quest. What had seemed like the discovery of an ancient artifact had actually been the fulfillment of prophecies that predicted humanity's eventual recognition of its own deepest nature. The silent bell had never been lost because it had never been separate from the very consciousness that sought it. The implications of this understanding rippled through scholarly communities throughout the known world. Universities that had based their curricula on the assumption that knowledge existed separate from the knower found themselves questioning fundamental premises about the nature of learning and wisdom. Students who had been trained to accumulate information began to discover that true knowledge emerged from the silence that preceded and contained all thoughts. Master Lin, a renowned philosopher who had initially approached the monastery's teachings with academic skepticism, experienced a complete reversal of understanding during a 6-month residency in the mountain region. Her rigorous intellectual training had prepared her to analyze and critique spiritual claims, yet prolonged exposure to authentic silence gradually dissolved the boundary between knower and known that had formed the foundation of her scholarly identity. Her subsequent writings attempted to describe this dissolution of subject-object duality through the precision of philosophical language, yet she consistently acknowledged that the reality she sought to convey could only be experienced directly. Her work became influential not because it explained the silent bell phenomenon, but because it demonstrated how intellectual understanding could become a gateway to direct realization rather than a substitute for it. The natural world continued to respond to the transformation in human consciousness with increasingly dramatic manifestations of renewed vitality. Forests that had been depleted by centuries of exploitation began to regenerate with remarkable speed in regions where communities had embraced the understanding emanating from the monastery. Rivers ran cleaner, wildlife populations flourished, and agricultural yields increased despite reduced intervention and fewer external inputs. These environmental changes attracted the attention of natural philosophers who sought to understand the mechanisms by which consciousness could influence physical systems. Their investigations led to discoveries that challenged conventional assumptions about the relationship between mind and matter, suggesting that awareness itself might be a fundamental force in the natural world, rather than merely an emergent property of complex biological systems. The children born into communities that had been transformed by the silent bell's influence displayed remarkable characteristics that distinguished them from previous generations. They demonstrated intuitive wisdom that typically required decades of spiritual practice to develop, yet they expressed this understanding so naturally that it seemed to be their inherent birthright rather than an acquired achievement. These children became living demonstrations of humanity's potential when consciousness was allowed to develop without the distortions created by fear-based conditioning. Their playfulness contained profound teachings. Their conflicts resolved themselves through organic processes of recognition and forgiveness, and their learning occurred through absorption and integration rather than struggle and effort. Educational systems throughout the region evolved to accommodate these gifted children, though the changes required were less about adding new curricula than about creating space for natural wisdom to unfold. Schools became centers of contemplative learning where knowledge emerged from silence rather than being imposed through repetition and memorization. The monastery's influence continued to expand through unexpected channels as travelers carried the seeds of transformation to distant lands. Sea merchants who had experienced the profound peace of the mountain communities brought that quality to port cities across vast ocean distances. Caravan traders carried silent teachings along silk roads that connected diverse cultures and civilizations. Each cultural context provided unique opportunities for the silent bell's influence to manifest in ways that honored local traditions while transcending their limitations. The understanding proved to be remarkably adaptable, expressing itself through whatever forms were most appropriate to each particular community, while maintaining its essential transformative power. In the northern kingdoms, where harsh climates had traditionally fostered fierce independence and competitive survival strategies, the influence manifested as an unprecedented spirit of cooperation that allowed communities to thrive in previously impossible conditions. Shared resources and collective wisdom replaced individual hoarding and secretive knowledge, creating resilience that surpassed what any single family or clan could achieve through isolation. The southern desert regions experienced the influence as a deepening of their traditional contemplative practices with nomadic tribes, discovering that their ancient ceremonies and seasonal migrations could become vehicles for the same profound realization that had transformed the mountain monasteries. Their shamans and tribal elders recognized in the silent bell, teaching a confirmation of wisdom they had carried for generations without fully understanding its ultimate significance. Abbot Tashi, now advanced in his own years of service, began to sense that his role as guardian of the monastery's mission was approaching its natural completion. Yet, unlike his predecessors' focused preparation for transition, Tashi's approach involved a gradual dissolution of his leadership function rather than its transfer to another individual. The understanding had become so thoroughly integrated into the community's consciousness that formal authority was becoming unnecessary. The monastery was evolving toward a form of collective guidance that operated through consensus, achieved in silence rather than through discussion and debate. Decisions emerged from the contemplative communion of the entire community, arising with such clarity and unanimity that formal processes of deliberation became superfluous. This development represented, perhaps, the most radical innovation in the monastery's long history, the transcendence of hierarchical spiritual authority in favor of direct democratic wisdom. The model attracted attention from political theorists and social philosophers who recognized its potential implications for governance systems throughout the civilized world. The silent bell's influence had thus evolved far beyond its origins as a personal spiritual quest or even a monastic teaching. It had become a demonstration of humanity's capacity for collective awakening, a proof that consciousness itself could evolve to higher levels of organization and effectiveness. The legendary bell that had been sought in ancient temples and sacred groves had revealed itself as the awakened human community, resonating with the fundamental harmony that connected all existence. As the story of the silent bell entered its next phase of unfolding, the boundary between legend and reality had become so thoroughly dissolved that future generations would find it impossible to distinguish between the mythical artifact of ancient prophecy and the living truth that had transformed their world. The bell that had been lost had been found not in some distant place or time, but in the eternal now that was always available to any consciousness willing to listen deeply enough to hear the silence from which all sound emerged and to which it inevitably returned. The wheel of seasons had turned countless times since the silent bell's influence first began its subtle transformation of human consciousness. Yet the monastery remained unchanged in its essential nature while continuing to evolve in ways that defied conventional understanding. Abbot Tashi, now white-haired and bearing the quiet dignity of one who had witnessed the unfolding of profound truth, observed how the teaching had grown beyond any single institution or geographical location to become a living principle that operated through the very fabric of existence itself. The monastery had reached a state of such transparency that visitors often failed to recognize its significance until they had already been transformed by their encounter with it. The buildings themselves seemed to radiate the silence that had been discovered within their walls, creating an atmosphere where the deepest questions of human existence found their natural resolution without the need for elaborate philosophical discourse or complex spiritual practices. Young seekers continued to arrive from distant lands, though their motivations had evolved considerably from those of earlier generations. Rather than seeking dramatic spiritual experiences or mystical revelations, they came with an intuitive recognition that something essential was missing from their lives, something that could only be found through the quality of presence they had heard described in whispered legends and traveling songs. Brother May, who had joined the community as a child and grown to maturity within its contemplative atmosphere, embodied the natural wisdom that emerged when consciousness was allowed to develop without the distortions created by conventional education and social conditioning. Her understanding required no validation from external authorities because it arose directly from the silence that connected all beings to their deepest nature. The economic systems that had evolved in regions influenced by the monastery's teaching demonstrated how humans' activity could align with natural principles without sacrificing prosperity or innovation. Markets operated through principles of mutual benefit rather than competitive exploitation, creating abundance that was shared equitably among all participants rather than concentrated in the hands of a privileged few. These economic transformations had attracted attention from rulers and administrators throughout the known world, many of whom attempted to replicate the monastery's success through policy changes and institutional reforms. Yet, their efforts consistently failed to produce the desired results because they addressed symptoms rather than the fundamental shift in consciousness that was the true source of the transformation they sought to emulate. The Silent Bell's influence had revealed that sustainable change could only occur through the awakening of individual awareness rather than through the manipulation of external circumstances. This understanding had profound implications for every aspect of human civilization, from governance and education to art and agriculture, suggesting that the solutions to humanity's greatest challenges lay not in technological advancement or political revolution, but in the recognition of the peace that already existed within every conscious being. Master Yuki, a former warrior who had abandoned his military career after experiencing the monastery's transformative influence, had become a living demonstration of how even the most deeply conditioned patterns of behavior could be transcended through authentic spiritual realization. His journey from violence to peace had occurred not through moral effort or psychological therapy, but through the simple recognition that his true nature was fundamentally incompatible with causing harm to others. The children who had grown up in communities touched by the Silent Bell's influence were now adults themselves, and their approach to parenting reflected the wisdom they had absorbed through their unconventional upbringing. They created families based on mutual respect and shared contemplation rather than hierarchical control and behavioral modification, allowing their own children to develop according to their inherent wisdom rather than according to imposed expectations. These families served as laboratories for discovering how human relationships could function when based on recognition of the silence that connected all beings, rather than on the fear and need that typically drove interpersonal dynamics. Their marriages demonstrated unprecedented stability and satisfaction. Their children exhibited remarkable emotional maturity and creative intelligence, and their communities benefited from the harmony that naturally radiated from households organized around contemplative principles. The monastery's archives had evolved into something far more dynamic than a repository of ancient texts and traditional teachings. They had become a living record of humanity's ongoing spiritual evolution, documenting the countless ways that consciousness could recognize itself through the diverse circumstances and cultural contexts that comprised the human experience. Scholars who came to study these records found themselves participating in the very process they sought to understand their research, becoming a form of contemplative practice that transformed their relationship to knowledge itself. The boundary between observer and observed dissolved in the presence of teachings that could only be comprehended through direct participation rather than analytical examination. The influence of the Silent Bell had spread so thoroughly throughout the region that entire kingdoms now operated according to principles that would have been considered impossible by previous generations. Conflicts between nations were resolved through contemplative dialogue rather than military confrontation. Trade agreements were negotiated through mutual recognition of shared benefit rather than competitive advantage, and cultural exchanges occurred through celebration of diversity rather than attempts at domination or conversion. These political transformations had been achieved without the dramatic upheavals that typically accompanied social change, unfolding instead through the gradual recognition that cooperation produced superior results to competition in virtually every domain of human activity. The understanding had spread organically through the countless individual transformations that occurred when people encountered authentic examples of consciousness at peace with itself. The natural world had responded to these changes in human consciousness with increasing vitality and abundance, as if the planet itself were awakening from a long period of dormancy. Ecosystems that had been degraded by centuries of exploitation began to regenerate with remarkable speed. Wildlife populations flourished in regions where human activity had become aligned with natural principles, and climate patterns seemed to stabilize in ways that supported rather than threatened the continuation of life. Environmental philosophers who studied these phenomena found themselves questioning fundamental assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and physical reality, discovering that the artificial separation between mind and matter that had dominated scientific thinking for centuries might be a conceptual error rather than an accurate description of how existence actually functioned. The monastery's influence on artistic expression had been equally profound, inspiring works that conveyed the ineffable quality of silence through various creative mediums. Painters created images that seemed to radiate peace directly into the viewer's consciousness. Musicians composed melodies that induced states of deep contemplation, and poets crafted verses that pointed toward truths that could not be captured in ordinary language, yet somehow became accessible through the artistry of their expression. These artistic achievements served not as entertainment or decoration, but as transmission devices for the understanding that had been discovered through contemplative practice, allowing the silent bell's influence to reach individuals who might not otherwise have encountered formal spiritual teaching. Art became a bridge between the transcendent realization of awakened consciousness and the ordinary experience of daily life. Abbot Tashi recognized that his own role in maintaining and transmitting the monastery's teaching was approaching its natural completion, not through death or retirement, but through the recognition that the understanding had become so thoroughly integrated into the consciousness of the community that formal leadership was no longer necessary. The monastery was evolving toward a form of collective awakening that transcended the need for individual authority or hierarchical organization. This transition represented perhaps the most significant development in the silent bell's continuing influence, demonstrating that spiritual communities could function through shared wisdom rather than through dependence on exceptional individuals. The model suggested possibilities for human organization that went far beyond conventional concepts of democracy or consensus, pointing toward forms of collective intelligence that could emerge when individual consciousness was aligned with universal principles. The pilgrims who visited the monastery during this period often remarked that they could no longer identify any single person as the source of the teaching they encountered. Yet, they found themselves profoundly transformed by their experience of the community as a whole. The silent bell had become so thoroughly embodied by the entire community that its influence operated through every interaction, every shared meal, every moment of contemplative silence. The legend of the silent bell had thus completed its transformation from ancient myth to living reality, revealing that the most profound spiritual truths could not be preserved in static form, but could only exist through the dynamic of expression of awakened consciousness in each moment. The bell that had been sought in distant temples and sacred groves had revealed itself as the very capacity for recognition that allowed any seeker to discover their own deepest nature. The monastery continued to serve as a beacon for those drawn to authentic spiritual realization, yet its function had evolved beyond providing specific teachings or practices to offering direct transmission of the understanding that was the birthright of every conscious being. Visitors arrived seeking the legendary silent bell and discovered that they had been carrying it within their own hearts all along, waiting only for the right conditions to recognize what had never actually been lost. The story of the silent bell had become a teaching about the nature of seeking itself, demonstrating that the object of all spiritual search was identical with the consciousness that was doing the searching. This recognition marked not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new phase of existence in which every moment became an opportunity to embody and share the peace that had been discovered through the dissolution of the artificial separation between seeker and sought. The silent bell continued to ring across the generations, its soundless song awakening recognition in every heart that was ready to hear the truth that connected all existence in the eternal silence from which all experience emerged and to which it inevitably returned. The passage of centuries had woven the silent bell's influence so thoroughly into the fabric of human existence that scholars of later ages would struggle to identify a time when consciousness had operated according to different principles. The monastery, now ancient beyond measure, had become less a place than a quality of awareness that permeated every corner of the known world, touching lives in ways so subtle and profound that its presence was felt more than seen. The descendants of those first villages that had been transformed by Brother Kenji's presence carried within their very being the seeds of the understanding he had embodied. They moved through their daily lives with an ease and grace that seemed to flow from some inexhaustible inner source, creating communities that functioned with the harmonious efficiency of natural systems rather than the forced coordination of human institutions. Brother Juan, whose great-grandfather had been one of the children who gathered around Kenji in those early village squares, had never known a world where conflict was resolved through violence or where economic relationships were based on exploitation rather than mutual benefit. For him and his generation, the principles that had once seemed revolutionary had become as natural and inevitable as breathing or the cycle of seasons. The monastery itself had evolved into something unprecedented in human history, an institution that had transcended its own institutional nature so completely that its essential function operated independently of any physical location or organizational structure. The buildings remained maintained by countless generations of devoted practitioners, yet the true monastery existed wherever consciousness recognized its own fundamental silence. The influence had spread across continents through trade routes and cultural exchanges, carried not by missionaries or conquerors, but by ordinary individuals whose transformed presence naturally awakened similar recognition in others. Sea captains whose ships sailed with unprecedented safety through storms that would have destroyed vessels guided by conventional navigation found that their success stemmed from an intuitive connection to natural forces that conventional seamanship could not explain. Desert merchants whose caravans traveled routes that had been plagued by conflict for generations discovered that their passage seemed to pacify even the most hostile territories, as if their inner peace created a field of harmony that extended beyond their immediate presence to influence everyone they encountered. Their success was measured not merely in profitable trade, but in the lasting friendships and alliances that formed wherever their journeys took them. The transformation of entire civilizations had occurred through this gentle influence, creating societies that operated according to principles that previous generations would have considered impossible. Wars had become so rare that military historians struggled to find examples of armed conflict that had occurred within living memory, not because of superior weapons or defensive strategies, but because the fundamental causes of human conflict had been addressed at their source in consciousness itself. Educational systems throughout the world had evolved to support the development of this natural wisdom, creating schools that functioned more like gardens where consciousness could unfold according to its inherent patterns, rather than factories where predetermined knowledge was imposed through repetition and memorization. Children learned through contemplative absorption rather than competitive struggle, developing intellectual capabilities that far exceeded what previous educational methods had been able to achieve. The arts had undergone a renaissance that made previous cultural achievements seem primitive by comparison, not through technical innovation, but through the artist's capacity to channel the profound silence that had become accessible to anyone willing to listen deeply enough. Musicians composed symphonies that induced states of transcendent awareness in their audiences. Painters created images that seemed to radiate peace directly into the viewer's consciousness. And poets crafted verses that conveyed truths too subtle for ordinary language, yet somehow became comprehensible through the artistry of their expression. Scientific's understanding had advanced through the recognition that consciousness was not separate from the natural world, but was itself a fundamental force that could be studied and understood through contemplative investigation rather than purely analytical methods. Researchers discovered that their most profound insights emerged not through intellectual effort, but through periods of silent receptivity that allowed natural intelligence to reveal itself directly. The boundary between science and spirituality had dissolved so completely that future generations would find it impossible to understand how these domains had ever been considered separate. The universe revealed itself as a unified field of conscious intelligence that could be explored through both rigorous experimentation and contemplative inquiry, each approach confirming and enriching the discoveries made through the other. Economic systems had evolved to support this transformation of human consciousness, creating forms of prosperity that enhanced rather than degraded the natural world. The concept of scarcity that had driven competitive behavior for millennia had been replaced by the recognition of fundamental abundance that became accessible when human activity aligned with natural principles rather than opposing them. Markets operated through principles of mutual enhancement rather than zero-sum competition, creating wealth that was shared equitably among all participants, while simultaneously regenerating the environmental systems that supported all economic activity. The artificial separation between human prosperity and ecological health had been revealed as a conceptual error that had caused unnecessary suffering for countless generations. The monastery's archives had become a repository of humanity's spiritual evolution, documenting the countless ways that consciousness had learned to recognize itself through the infinite diversity of human experience. Yet, these records were consulted not as historical curiosities, but as living teachings that continued to offer guidance for the ongoing transformation of human awareness. Scholars who studied these archives found that their research became a form of contemplative practice that transformed their relationship to knowledge itself. The information they sought revealed itself not through analytical investigation, but through participatory understanding that dissolved the artificial boundary between knower and known researcher and subject matter. The children born into this transformed world exhibited capabilities that would have been considered miraculous by previous generations. Yet, they expressed these gifts so naturally that they seemed to represent humanity's normal potential rather than exceptional achievements. They demonstrated intuitive wisdom that typically required decades of spiritual practice to develop creative intelligence that solved problems through insight rather than effort, and emotional maturity that allowed them to maintain inner peace regardless of external circumstances. These children became teachers for their elders, not through formal instruction, but through the natural expression of their unconditioned awareness. Their playfulness contained profound teachings about the nature of reality. Their conflicts resolved themselves through organic processes of recognition and forgiveness, and their learning occurred through absorption and integration rather than struggle and memorization. The influence of the silent bell had thus completed its transformation from ancient legend to present reality, demonstrating that the most profound spiritual truths could not be preserved in static form, but could only exist through the dynamic expression of awakened consciousness in each generation. The bell that had been sought in distant temples and sacred groves had revealed itself as the very capacity for recognition that allowed any being to discover their own deepest nature. The monastery continued to receive pilgrims from across the world, though their motivations had evolved considerably from those of earlier seekers. Rather than searching for dramatic spiritual experiences or mystical revelations, they came with the intuitive recognition that something essential had been awakened in human consciousness, something that could be directly experienced through the simple act of sincere listening. The teachings they encountered were no longer exotic imports from distant spiritual traditions, but expressions of universal principles that had become as natural and accessible as sunlight or flowing water. The silent bell's influence had revealed that enlightenment was not a rare achievement reserved for exceptional individuals, but the natural inheritance of every conscious being who was willing to recognize what had never actually been absent. The story of the silent bell had become a teaching about the nature of consciousness itself, demonstrating that the peace that all beings sought was not something to be attained through effort, but something to be recognized through the simple act of stopping the search and listening to the silence that had always been present. This recognition marked not the end of spiritual development, but the beginning of a new phase of human evolution in which every moment became an opportunity to embody and share the understanding that connected all existence. The silent bell continued to ring across the ages, its soundless song awakening recognition in every heart that was ready to hear the truth that had been spoken in the first moment of creation and would continue to resonate until the last conscious being returned to the source from which all awareness emerged. The legend had become reality through the simple recognition that what was sought had never been lost, what was desired had always been present, and what was needed was already complete within the eternal silence that was the true nature of every being who had ever drawn breath under the infinite sky. The wheel of existence had turned through countless seasons since the first seeker had set foot upon the mountain path in search of the legendary silent bell. Yet the essence of that original quest continued to unfold through dimensions of understanding that transcended the boundaries of time and space. The monastery, now more ancient than memory itself, had become a living testament to the truth that consciousness, once awakened to its own fundamental nature, creates ripples that extend infinitely through the fabric of reality itself. The current generation of practitioners moved through their contemplative routines with such natural grace that observers often failed to recognize the profound transformation their presence embodied. These individuals had been born into a world where the principles discovered through centuries of spiritual exploration had become as fundamental as the laws governing the movement of celestial bodies, integrated so completely into human existence that their revolutionary nature was evident only to those who possessed historical perspective on the journey that had brought humanity to this point. Brother Tao, whose lineage traced back through 7 generations of monastery practitioners, embodied the culmination of this extended spiritual evolution. His understanding required no external validation or complex philosophical frameworks, because It arose directly from the silence that had been recognized and nurtured by countless predecessors, each contributing their own realization to the collective wisdom that now flowed through every aspect of monastic life. The influence emanating from the monastery had achieved such universality that the distinction between sacred and secular space had become meaningless. Pilgrims arriving from distant lands often discovered that their transformation had begun long before they reached the mountain gates, initiated by their contact with individuals who had been touched by the understanding that now permeated human consciousness like water saturating fertile soil. The economic systems that had evolved in regions influenced by the monastery's teaching demonstrated how human activity could align perfectly with cosmic principles without sacrificing innovation or prosperity. Communities operated through forms of cooperation so natural and efficient that competition had become not forbidden but simply unnecessary, recognized as a primitive response to perceived scarcity that dissolved when consciousness awakened to the abundance that was the universe's fundamental nature. Trade relationships spanning vast distances functioned through principles of mutual enhancement that created prosperity for all participants, while simultaneously strengthening the ecological systems that supported economic activity. The artificial separation between human welfare and environmental health had been revealed as a conceptual error that had caused unnecessary suffering for countless generations before being transcended through the recognition of fundamental interconnectedness. The educational institutions that had developed under this influence bore little resemblance to the schools of previous eras, having evolved into environments where learning occurred through contemplative absorption rather than competitive struggle. Children developed intellectual capabilities that far exceeded what conventional educational methods had been able to achieve, not through superior techniques, but through the recognition that consciousness itself was the source of all genuine knowledge. These young individuals demonstrated intuitive understanding of principles that had required decades of study for previous generations to grasp, yet they expressed this wisdom so naturally that it seemed to represent humanity's normal potential rather than exceptional achievement. Their presence served as a constant reminder that enlightenment was not a rare attainment reserved for spiritual elites, but the natural inheritance of every conscious being willing to recognize what had never actually been absent. The arts had undergone a transformation so profound that previous cultural achievements seemed like preliminary sketches compared to masterworks. Musicians created compositions that induced states of transcendent awareness in their audiences, not through technical complexity, but through their capacity to channel the profound silence that had become accessible to anyone willing to listen deeply enough. Their melodies carried the essence of the silent bell's teaching, transmitting understanding directly through sound in ways that bypassed intellectual analysis entirely. Visual artists painted images that seemed to radiate peace directly into the viewer's consciousness, their brush strokes guided by an intuitive understanding of how color and form could serve as vehicles for spiritual transmission. Poets crafted verses that conveyed truths too subtle for ordinary language, yet somehow became comprehensible through the artistry of their expression, their words carrying readers into direct experience of the realities they described. The boundaries between different artistic disciplines had dissolved as creators recognized that all authentic expression emerged from the same source of silent awareness. Painters composed with their brushes, Musicians painted with their instruments and poets sculpted meaning from the raw material of consciousness itself, each art form becoming a different facet of the same fundamental creative force. Scientific understanding had advanced through the integration of contemplative inquiry with rigorous experimentation, revealing a universe that operated according to principles of consciousness rather than mere mechanical causation. Researchers discovered that their most profound insights emerged not through intellectual effort, but through periods of receptive silence that allowed natural intelligence to reveal itself directly. The artificial separation between observer and observed that had limited scientific inquiry for centuries had been transcended through the recognition that consciousness was not separate from the phenomena it studied, but was itself the fundamental fabric from which all experience emerged. This understanding had opened entirely new domains of investigation that previous generations of scientists could not have imagined. Medical practitioners had learned to work with the body's innate healing intelligence, rather than simply treating symptoms through external intervention. Their diagnostic abilities had been enhanced through contemplative attunement to the subtle energies that governed physical health, allowing them to address imbalances at their source in consciousness rather than merely managing their manifestations in the material body. The healing arts had evolved to include not only the restoration of physical health, but the awakening of the spiritual understanding that was recognized as the foundation of all genuine well-being. Hospitals had become centers of contemplative healing, where patients experienced not only recovery from illness, but profound transformation of their relationship to existence itself. Governance systems throughout the world had evolved beyond the need for hierarchical authority, structures operating instead through forms of collective wisdom that emerged from the contemplative communion of entire communities. Decisions arose with such clarity and unanimity that formal processes of deliberation had become unnecessary, replaced by direct recognition of solutions that served the highest good of all participants. Legal systems had been transformed through the understanding that justice could not be achieved through punishment, but only through the restoration of harmony that occurred when all parties recognized their fundamental interconnectedness. Conflicts that would have required years of litigation in previous eras resolved themselves through contemplative dialogue that revealed the underlying unity that had been obscured by surface disagreements. The monastery's archives had become far more than a repository of historical documents, evolving into a living record of consciousness, exploring its own infinite potential through the countless forms that human experience could take. Scholars who came to study these records found themselves participating in the very process they sought to understand, their research becoming a form of contemplative practice that dissolved the boundary between investigator and subject matter. The texts contained within these archives were not merely intellectual exercises, but transmission devices for the understanding that had been discovered through generations of contemplative practice. Reading became a form of meditation that allowed ancient insights to awaken fresh recognition in each new generation of seekers, ensuring that wisdom remained alive and relevant rather than becoming fossilized dogma. Brother Tao recognized that his own role in maintaining this tradition was part of an unbroken chain of transmission that extended back to the original seekers who had first ventured into the mountains in search of the legendary silent bell. Yet, He understood that this chain was not a linear sequence of teachers passing knowledge to students, but a continuous recognition of the same timeless truth expressing itself through countless individual discoveries. The silent bell that had been sought as an external object had revealed itself as the very capacity for recognition that allowed any seeker to discover their own deepest nature. This understanding had been transmitted not through words or concepts, but through the direct influence of awakened consciousness touching other consciousness, creating resonances that spread naturally throughout human awareness like waves expanding across a still pond. The monastery continued to receive visitors from across the world, though their motivations had evolved beyond seeking specific teachings or practices to recognizing that something essential had been awakened in human consciousness itself. They came not as students seeking instruction, but as expressions of consciousness, recognizing itself in various forms, each encounter serving to deepen and enrich the collective understanding. The influence of the silent bell had demonstrated that enlightenment was not an individual achievement, but a collective awakening that occurred when enough beings recognized their fundamental nature to create a critical mass of conscious awareness. This awakening continued to spread through subtle transmission that required no formal religious structures or institutional frameworks, operating instead through the natural affinity that consciousness felt for itself, wherever it was authentically expressed. The story of the silent bell had become a teaching about the nature of time itself, revealing that the past, present, and future were artificial divisions that dissolved when consciousness recognized its eternal dimension. The bell that had been lost in ancient times and found through dedicated seeking was simultaneously the bell that was ringing in the present moment and the bell that would continue to sound throughout all future generations of conscious beings. The legend had completed its transformation from mythical narrative to living reality, demonstrating that the most profound truths could not be preserved in static form, but existed only through the dynamic recognition that occurred when consciousness encountered itself in ever-fresh expressions of awakened awareness. The silent bell continued to ring across eternity, its soundless song awakening recognition in every heart that was ready to hear the truth that connected all existence in the eternal silence from which all experience emerged and to which it inevitably returned. The circle that had begun with one seeker's quest for a legendary artifact had revealed itself to be complete, in every moment encompassing all beings, in the recognition that what was sought had never been separate from the one who was seeking, and what was found had always been present in the very awareness that made the search possible. The final understanding dawned not with fanfare or revelation, but with the gentle inevitability of sunrise illuminating a landscape that had always existed, yet had never been truly seen. Brother Tao, now bearing the accumulated wisdom of countless generations, stood in the monastery courtyard where the first seekers had once gathered to hear tales of the legendary silent bell, recognizing that the circle of seeking had not merely closed, but had revealed itself to have been complete from the very beginning. The monastery had transcended even its own transcendence, becoming so perfectly transparent to the truth it embodied that visitors often failed to recognize they had arrived at their destination until they realized they were already home. The buildings themselves seemed to breathe with the rhythm of universal consciousness, their ancient stones having absorbed so much contemplative presence that they radiated peace like warmth from glowing embers. The influence that had begun with one monk's simple quest had evolved into something that could no longer be contained within the boundaries of human understanding, having become a fundamental force in the evolution of consciousness itself. Every being who had ever been touched by authentic silence carried within themselves the capacity to awaken that same recognition in others, creating an endless chain of transmission that operated through the very fabric of existence. Brother Tao reflected on the profound irony that had emerged through centuries of spiritual exploration. The silent bell that countless seekers had pursued as an external object had revealed itself to be the very awareness that was capable of seeking. The legendary artifact had never been separate from the consciousness that yearned for it, just as the ocean was never separate from the waves that comprised its surface. The monastery's daily rhythms continued with the same timeless simplicity that had characterized monastic life for generations, yet every ordinary moment now contained the fullness of eternity. Sweeping leaves became a celebration of impermanence. Preparing meals became an offering to the interconnectedness of all life, and sitting in meditation became a recognition of the stillness that was always present beneath the movement of thoughts and sensations. The children who had grown up in this transformed world possessed a naturalness that previous generations could barely comprehend, moving through their lives with the fluid grace of water flowing around obstacles. They had never known a world where consciousness was considered separate from its environment, where competition was necessary for survival, or where inner peace was regarded as a luxury rather than the foundation of effective action. These young beings served as living bridges between the world that had been and the world that was becoming, their very existence proof that humanity's spiritual evolution was not a distant goal, but a present reality unfolding through each generation's deeper recognition of its own true nature. They carried within their cells the memory of the transformation that had occurred, ensuring that the understanding would continue to propagate through biological as well as spiritual transmission. The arts had evolved beyond all previous conception of creative expression, becoming vehicles for the direct transmission of enlightened consciousness, rather than mere entertainment or aesthetic appreciation. Musicians had learned to compose with silence itself, creating spaces within their melodies where listeners could discover the source of all sound. Painters worked with light and shadow to reveal the luminous awareness that perceived all visual phenomena. Poets had developed languages that pointed directly toward the ineffable dimension of existence, their words serving as doorways through which readers could step into direct experience of the truths being conveyed. Every authentic artistic creation had become a fragment of the silent bell, carrying its essence into realms where conventional spiritual teaching could not penetrate. The economic systems that had developed under this influence operated through principles so natural and efficient that scarcity had become literally unthinkable. Communities functioned like healthy ecosystems, each individual contributing their unique gifts while simultaneously being nourished by the collective abundance that emerged from harmonious cooperation. Trade relationships spanning continents had evolved into celebrations of diversity rather than competitions for resources, with merchants serving as cultural ambassadors who carried not merely goods, but the understanding that prosperity was a shared inheritance rather than a limited commodity to be hoarded. The flow of wealth had become as natural and beneficial as the circulation of blood through a healthy body. Scientific understanding had reached levels that integrated material knowledge with spiritual wisdom, revealing a universe that operated according to principles of conscious intelligence rather than mere mechanical causation. Researchers had learned to approach their investigations with the same contemplative receptivity that characterized advanced spiritual practice, allowing natural law to reveal itself through direct insight rather than forcing it to conform to preconceived theoretical frameworks. Medical practice had evolved into an art of awakening the body's innate healing wisdom, with practitioners serving as facilitators of the natural restoration that occurred when consciousness recognized its fundamental wholeness. Hospitals had become centers of contemplative healing, where patients experienced not merely recovery from illness, but profound transformation of their entire relationship to existence. The educational systems that had developed throughout the world bore no resemblance to the competitive institutions of previous eras, having evolved into environments where learning occurred through the natural expansion of awareness rather than the accumulation of information. Children developed their intellectual faculties through contemplative exploration that honored their innate wisdom, while simultaneously connecting them to the accumulated understanding of human civilization. These schools functioned more like gardens where consciousness could unfold according to its inherent patterns than factories where predetermined knowledge was imposed through repetition and memorization. Students and teachers engaged in collaborative discovery that enriched both parties, creating communities of inquiry that continuously expanded the boundaries of human understanding. Governance had transcended the need for hierarchical authority structures, operating instead through forms of collective wisdom that emerged from the contemplative communion of entire populations. Decisions arose through process of deep listening that revealed solutions serving the highest good of all participants, making traditional political mechanisms as obsolete as oil lamps in an age of electric illumination. Legal systems had been transformed by the recognition that justice could not be achieved through punishment, but only through the restoration of harmony that occurred when all parties acknowledged their fundamental interconnectedness. Courts had become centers of healing, where conflicts were resolved through contemplative dialogue that revealed the underlying unity obscured by surface disagreements. The monastery's influence on international relations had been particularly profound, with entire civilizations discovering that cooperation produced superior results to competition in virtually every domain of human activity. Wars had become so rare that military historians struggled to find examples of armed conflict within living memory, not because of superior weapons or defensive strategies, but because the fundamental causes of human conflict had been addressed at their source in consciousness itself. Brother Tao recognized that his own role in this vast transformation was simultaneously infinitely significant and completely unnecessary. Part of an eternal dance of consciousness, recognizing itself through countless individual expressions while never being limited by any particular form. He was both the culmination of an ancient lineage of wisdom and a temporary wave in the endless ocean of awareness, neither more nor less important than any other being who had ever drawn breath under the infinite sky. The monastery continued to receive visitors from across the world, though the nature of their pilgrimage had evolved beyond seeking specific teachings or experiences to recognizing that they were participating in consciousness exploring its own infinite potential. Each encounter became an opportunity for mutual awakening with guest and host, serving alternately as teacher and student in the eternal classroom of present moment awareness. The silent bell had achieved its ultimate purpose by revealing that it had never been lost, never been separate from those who sought it, and never been anything other than the very capacity for recognition that made all seeking possible. The legend had become reality, not through the discovery of an external artifact, but through the collective awakening to the truth that had always been present within every conscious being. The story of the silent bell had demonstrated that enlightenment was not an individual achievement, but a collective recognition that occurred when enough beings acknowledged their fundamental nature to create a critical mass of awakened awareness. This understanding continued to spread through the subtle transmission that required no formal religious structures or institutional frameworks, operating instead through the natural affinity that consciousness felt for itself, wherever it was authentically expressed. The monastery itself had become a symbol of humanity's potential rather than a unique spiritual sanctuary, demonstrating that the peace and wisdom it embodied could emerge anywhere that beings were willing to listen deeply enough to hear the silence that connected all existence. Every home could become a monastery, every workplace could become a temple, and every moment could become an opportunity for the recognition that transformed seeking into finding. The bell that had been sought through countless lifetimes of spiritual practice had revealed itself to be ringing continuously in the eternal, now its soundless song, available to any consciousness willing to become still enough to hear what had never stopped being spoken. The silence that gave birth to all sound was simultaneously the destination of every spiritual journey and the very ground from which all journeys began. Brother Tao smiled with the gentle understanding that came from recognizing a truth so simple it had been overlooked by countless generations of seekers. The silent bell was not something to be found because it was never lost, not something to be achieved because it was already complete, and not something to be understood because it was the very awareness that made all understanding possible. The legend had become reality through the recognition that what was sought was identical with what was seeking, what was desired was already present, and what was needed was eternally available within the heart of every being who had ever wondered about the deeper meaning of existence. The silent bell continued to ring across all dimensions of space and time, its eternal presence awakening infinite expressions of the one consciousness that dreamed itself into countless forms, while never ceasing to be the formless awareness in which all dreams arose and dissolved. The story was complete because it had never begun. The journey was finished because it had never required movement, and the bell was found because it had always been sounding the silent song that called all beings home to the recognition of what they had never ceased to be.